Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Lentini, and I'm your host for the podcast Different Thinking for Different Times. And today I have a very interesting guest, and I think he'll stretch some of your thinking, which is what we're doing here. We're helping people stretch their thinking from small-minded, what I call limited thinking. And I'll show everybody the acorn because before it got on my shirt, it was just an acorn, and the analogy for how that little thing can become an oak tree. And same with our thinking, that our small-minded thinking is fine. It's okay. We're humans. And it's our job in life to learn and grow and stretch our thinking and have a dialogue with people. And this is a dialogue with Tom today about FarmKind. And when I read his bio and the work he's doing, and I checked out the website, I was fascinated. I think you will be, and we'll get right into it. So, Tom, tell us about yourself, how you got started with FarmKind, and what your mission is and what your hope is for America and for agriculture in general. So,
Yeah,
go ahead
sure.
right into it.
Thank you for having me. My name is Tom Norman, and I am the co-founder of FarmKind. We're an organization that tries to help people to make a difference to tackle the issue of factory farming. And specifically, we say you don't need to change your diet if that's not a good fit for you in order to make a really big difference to this issue. There are other ways we can do this, particularly supporting some of the charities out there that are doing some really incredible work to impact on this issue, to make the lives of animals better, to improve the climate, and actually to tackle some of the human health issues that come along with the issue of factory farming as well. So we can all actually make a really, really big difference to this issue. It's really quite easy to do. So that's our mission. The way we do this is we work with expert charity evaluators and grant makers to find a number of charities that are really, really impactful, doing incredible work, and are spending people's donations wisely. And then we take these charities and we say to people, look, if you want your donations, your gifts to go a long way to help the most animals, to make the biggest difference for this issue, these are some great charities to support.
You know, when you mention donations and people supporting what you're doing, remind me to connect you with Ali Horvat, who started Compassionista.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
I interviewed him maybe 5 months ago, and he's got a fascinating group and organization that he started looking to fund groups that are doing good, which is another mission of different thinking for different times, right? That to do good, everyone feels good, and to support people that are doing good, and especially if they're stretching the norm thinking, because there's no such thing as normal thinking, right? There's only what we continue to stretch ourselves and grow. And when we think about living in a universe, the James Webb telescope discovered a planet. I think they called it an exoplanet a couple weeks ago that's spinning at the rate of 756 rotations a minute, or it might have been a second, because they said it's spinning faster than a blender. So,
Wow, that's
right,
crazy.
if we think we know it all, just look at what the James Webb is discovering, and the Hubble, and the physicists that are doing work. So, when it comes to FarmKind, what are you hoping to achieve? Like, what's one of your biggest goals?
Yeah, so really our goal is to help the world to move past the issue of factory farming and to move to a factory-free, farming-free world. Because this particular way of raising animals for food is so destructive for our planet. It's actually putting our health at risk from things like pandemics and antibiotic-resistant diseases. And then it's also extremely cruel for animals. Who are sentient beings who can suffer and feel joy as well. And what we want to see is a world where we're not damaging our planet in this way. We're making food in a much kinder way. And the animals that are in the food system are having lives that are ultimately much, much better for them.
So, Are you suggesting that we get back to family farming?
I think that's part of the solution. I think is more smaller, more sustainable types of farming. But I think also we couldn't sustain the kind of 8 billion people we have on the planet with that, just with simply going back to sort of some sort of traditional way of farming. So what we need to do is evolve the food system to a place where it is giving us the kind of healthy and sustainable diet that we need, but in a way that is also not destroying our planet, that is using our resources wisely, and is not causing the sort of suffering of currently billions of animals. And this is very possible. We're already seeing kind of the seeds, the roots of this this new food system in things like, for example, some of the amazing work that's being done by scientists on cultivated meat, which is the ability to create things that are exactly sort of biologically, like at the cellular level, exactly the same as the meat that you would get from, like, say, a beef burger. Don't require an animal to produce these things. So you can actually just grow meat cells in a facility in like a factory, and this can produce food. It's already been approved by the FDA as completely safe and healthy, and we can actually make food this way. It costs a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions, of the land use, of the water use, of raising animals for our food instead. And so this combined with things like using more plant-based foods, things like alternative proteins, but also just healthy whole plant-based foods, can make a diet that is not only very tasty, also very healthy and sustainable for us and for our planet. And so I think eventually the food system is going to look like this combination of more kind of less industrialized animal agriculture, these kind of new food technologies, and also like a more use of plant-based foods for the population in general.
Well, yeah, certainly land is probably more productive depending on the quality of it for growing vegetables and fruits.
Yeah.
I did have a 17 and a half acre farm in Vermont, in Johnson, Vermont, for a number of years. And I raised chickens and turkeys and sheep and pigs. And in a very sustainable way. The sheep I raised for 4-H groups that wanted to start teaching kids how to raise animals. And so the lambs would go to all 4-H operations. And then eventually I sold all the animals to either 4-H or other farmers that were compassionate, because I had an offer to go to work in New York City. And so I rented the farm. And then the person that rented the farm grew some, raised chickens. And when I raised chickens, I had read that the factory farmers were feeding them in 8 weeks. They were going from birth to, I guess you'd say, the broiler in 8 weeks. And what I found was so many of the chickens got broken legs and heart attacks because they were giving them growth hormones. And so they were growing too fast. Their body was growing too fast for their legs to support it. And then often that same rapid growth caused a heart attack. So I fed them regular food, and they when they got old enough, they went out in the they went out in the farmyard. We had a certain area for them, and we would rotate their home that they would go in at night. And we raised them over 12 weeks. So it wasn't about the money; it was about the quality of the food. And we had less of a crop every year, but we raised them what we thought was a much more humane way. So I get the point of FarmKind doing that. Now, what are some of the ways you do it? So you want donations? You want the public to support you?
Yeah. So before I go on to that, if I could,
Sure.
I think your example there is like a really good illustration of exactly what we're talking about here. What you sort of laid out there, which is kind of like what we think of when we think about farming. Often, I think that's where like most of us like to imagine our food is coming from. We did some research actually recently. We looked at data from the Department for Agriculture, and we kind of worked out like, okay, how big are how many animals are being raised in kind of this like traditional sort of small farming kind of way, and how many animals are being raised on like the big industrial kind of factory farms, these
Yeah.
kind of really large places. And what we found actually was that less than it's about 0.1% of the animals are being raised on these small farms. Now, the small farms make up most farms. They're like 78% of farms in America are these kind of small farms, but they are raising 0.1% of the animals. And
Wow.
the vast majority of the animals are coming from actually a very small amount of places that have these very, very large farms. And what they do, to your point, is they're raising the animals and using things like growing them very quickly. Also using breeds specifically for chickens, using these breeds of chicken that grow really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And that's why they actually can't sustain themselves over sort of, for more than 8 weeks, because they've been genetically selectively bred so that their bodies grow really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And I think the reason I wanted to raise this was because I think we often think about how our food is natural. We say, it's very natural to eat meat, and it's very like this is our kind of natural diet. And I think the point I would make is that the way that we currently are eating meat, most of us, the vast majority of us, couldn't be further from what is kind of like this natural ideal. And I think it is that's useful context, because when we want to say okay, I don't think anybody thinks factory farming is a good thing, but sometimes people think it's a small thing. It's a few of the animals. It's not where I get my food from. It's kind of this small problem that's kind of over there. And I think it is actually worth kind of just highlighting that in America and in Europe and in kind of the Western world, the vast majority of the animal products we are getting, in fact, in America, it's about 99% are coming from these kinds of places.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, what are we doing about it? So FarmKind, we actually identify other organizations that are doing amazing work. So our job is to kind of look at if you kind of care about this issue, you think, I don't like this, I want to be part of the solution. There are so many organizations out there. How are you supposed to know which ones are doing really good work? Which ones are really making a difference? If you want to donate, who is actually spending your money wisely and making sure that it's actually making a difference, instead of going for I don't know, big salaries or on just some intervention that doesn't actually do anything. And so we solve that problem because we work with expert charity evaluators, and we work with grant makers whose job it is every day they're getting applied to by these charities, and they have to make decisions about which charities to support with their grant money. And so we talk to these guys who really know exactly, what the good charities out there are. They've got a really good sense of what the best opportunities for donations are. And we work with them to create this list of 6 charities, which are not necessarily the only really great charities, but they are 6 really great charities that people can support if they want to make a difference in this issue. And that will make a really big difference for animals, for the planet, and also for our health.
So then you're a resource for people to do some research and find the best causes to support?
That's right, yeah. So we you can use us as a jumping off point for your own research if you like, or if you don't have the time, because we don't all have the time to look into every issue, you can donate directly through us to these charities and say, okay, I'll trust that you guys have done the homework for me, and you can donate straight to the organizations through us. We don't keep any of people's donations. We simply pass it all on, because we ourselves are we're a nonprofit and we're funded by grants ourselves. So any donations that come through us just go straight to the charities that you support.
That's great. I was going to ask you next, how are you funded? And so then how do countries like this one, right? America's so large, how do they make this transition and maybe even get the attention of factory farming to do things differently? How is this happening in your mind, right? In what you guys are doing? Yeah,
I think that's a really good question. So I think that the starting point is we often think about these kind of industrialized agriculture as it's this massive industry. How are we possibly going to change it? I think it's worth remembering that in the US, really, this is a product of the 1970s and 60s, essentially. There is a concerted policy by the federal government to have bigger farming, sort of like get big or get out was the kind of the mantra. And this is really when we see the massive expansion of these kind of industrialized farms. So it's really not been around for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And that was a certain evolution of the food system. And now it's really time, as we understand the impacts of this on the environment and on animals, for us to evolve to kind of the next stage of our food system. Mm-hmm. So what I think that looks like is, I think it's these new technologies for food. So like cultivated meat, alternative proteins. Mm-hmm. It's also transitioning towards people having more options for plant-based alternatives and very healthy kind of whole food plant-based options. And then I think what's really important is that we also have a fair transition for farmers as well. So there are some amazing programs being run in places like Holland, for example, where government is giving kind of large funds of money that are there to help farmers who are currently raising animals, who want to move to plant-based agriculture, so raising crops and vegetables and things like this, and giving them the money they need to kind of support their transition. Because a lot of farmers these days are currently kept in these kind of they're kept in debt agreements with the big meat producers often. Yeah. And so it's very difficult for them. They can't just simply say, I'm going to stop farming my animals today, because they have all these kind of financial pressures on them. So that is really important that we also support them to move to a kind of a more sustainable future food system as well. And so I think these are really important kind of forward-looking things that we can do. But we can also help the animals that are currently existing in our food system to have better lives as well. So there are some amazing campaigns going on that are targeting kind of some of the cruelest practices. Things like, for example, keeping egg-laying hens in cages for their entire lives, where they're kept in a cage that's about the size. They have about as much size as a piece of paper, so they can't really even sort of open their wings or do the things that chickens do, like dust bathing, which is like how they clean their feathers and things like this.
Oh, I watched you do it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly normal behavior. That's what a chicken wants to do. They want to like flap around and they want to cover themselves in dust. It gets out the little kind of mites in their feathers and helps them to clean themselves off. And that's what they want to do and live in a nice little small flock. And what there are organizations like the Humane League, which is one of the charities that we support. They work to pressure companies, so say Walmart or KFC or Burger King or something like this, and they say, we want you to stop buying eggs from caged systems. So only commit to move to cage-free eggs in, like, say, 3 years' time. And these campaigns, you kind of get the public support and things like this. People will sometimes do a protest outside the office of these organizations, have been amazingly successful at pressuring companies. Those companies I mentioned have all committed to go cage free. Over 300 American companies, including some of the biggest names in food, have committed to going cage free or are now cage free. And the consequence of this is that about 15 years ago, when these campaigns started, 4% of the US egg-laying hen population was cage-free, and now it's 40%. So 10 times as many, which is amazing. It's absolutely life-transforming for these chickens. And it actually costs a tiny amount. So it costs about 85 cents to free one chicken from a cage for its life, which is almost nothing, right? And so these are campaigns that can make an amazing difference in the lives of the animals that are in the kind of food system today. And this is, I think, another really important piece of the kind of whole puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I know 25 chickens. I had 25 hens. We would do 150 broilers at a time, which was much smaller than the factory farms have tens of thousands in different buildings. And our egg layers were cage free, and it was fascinating to just go open the door in the morning, and as soon as the sun started setting, they would be back in the roosts at night. In the morning, there would be eggs there, and those 25 produced more eggs than we could eat, and people were paying because they knew what the chickens were eating. They knew that they were cage free. Back then, they were paying, which was 2008, 9, 10, they were paying $5 a dozen back then, and $4 a pound for the broilers, because, again, we didn't feed them anything that had hormones in it. And so the family farm the families around my farm loved to support it. Egg layers, hens, and neighbors were paying me $5 a dozen because I was getting 25 eggs a day, most days, sometimes 26, 27, and it was more than we could eat 7 days a week. And so neighbors were paying $5 a dozen back then because they knew, and that was 2007, 8, 9, they knew what they were being fed. They could come and watch the hens on the farm, walking around, mostly in the side yard, and even sometimes out in the front yard. Sometimes they'd even go on the road because it was a gravel road. It was not very traveled. There were 6 homes on the road in Johnson, Vermont, and it was fascinating. And then the broilers, we raised 150 at a time, not 10, 20, 30, 40,000. And again, they had free roam of the back of the barn. They would house in the barn at night. And people were paying $4 a pound for the broilers back then for the same reason. They knew what we fed them, and they knew they were free range, free to go do whatever. And then we had a very humane process that in order to convert them to help them make their transition, we called it, into what's next, which was food for the people in my community. And we had orders for them. We actually had a waiting list one time. We had sold the whole 150 when they were chicks. And so there were people that were ordering from the next batch. All right, when you get the next batch, which was 12 weeks.
Yeah.
So I like what you're talking about. And I understand there's going to be a transition, but it sounds like it's happening with 40% of hens, excuse me, now being free range.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Now, what about the politics of this? What do you have to deal with when it comes to where are you based? Where are you based?
So we are. I'm currently based in London. We, as an organization, we work all around the world. Actually, the charities we support work in the USA. They work in Europe and even in South America and Southeast Asia. And we have donors from all around the world, mainly in the US, actually, but all around the world.
Okay. So then when you think of the politics and all the places that you're operating and working to help influence farmers and now even factory farms for this change, because I imagine there's some resistance both politically and from some of the big factory farms.
Yeah. So I think in particular, the sort of traditional meat industry can be very resistant. So we've seen in the US, for example, a lot of lobbying from sort of big meat to try to really shut down a lot of this work. So a really good example of this is so-called ag-gag laws, which are restrictions on what you can do and say when it comes to trying to kind of really uncover and tell people about what's going on some of these really big industrial farms, and just using the law to shut people down, stop people from really engaging in their rightful sort of political speech. But then there's some really amazing stuff. So in California, Proposition 12 was a law that was passed, which created some basic welfare standards for chickens and for pigs in particular. So actually really world leading in many ways standards. And then required anyone who wants to sell into the state of California to abide by these rules. This was challenged by the meat industry with actually the support of the Biden administration. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And amazingly, I think, considering that you had the federal government and the meat industry both weighing in to try to bring this law down, the law was upheld, and the animals won in the Supreme Court, which was pretty incredible.
That is pretty incredible. And did you all support some of that work in the courts and organizations that were trying to get this? Make sure that it was pushed through?
So that was
maintained, I guess, right?
Yeah, maintained. Yeah, exactly. So that was before we were launched. This happened last year primarily. But one of the organisations that we do support, the Humane League, they certainly had a role in bringing this case forward, all the way from California all the way to the Supreme Court.
What do you think Robert Kennedy Jr.'s thoughts will be about? Because he's talked about getting the junk out of our food, and exposing some of the junk in the food, and then getting people to. In fact, I think there was an article over the weekend that talked about he flew with the new president on his plane, President Trump, and or the future president, and they had McDonald's on the plane. And Robert went along with it. But what he did say, he says, I'm going to be working with all the fast food chains to remove certain ingredients. And he said, for example, frying in beef tallow or beef fat as opposed to vegetable seed oil. Now, I don't know anything about these things. I don't know which one's better, but he's already raising some questions about how things are done. It kind of surprised me that seed oil wasn't such a good idea. I don't know, right? So... yes. What do you think of that in politics? Not so much RFK. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I can imagine what it's like with politics. But here's a guy that's going to be involved in actually looking at things and having us question the health value of some of the ingredients.
Yeah. So I can't. I won't speak to his specific kind of issues. But if I was going to sort of advise him, and if you want to get the kind of some of the most dangerous things out of our food system right now, then I would definitely suggest that they look at the use of antibiotics in industrial agriculture. So right now we feed in factory farming, we feed a lot of antibiotics to animals as a prophylactic, so to prevent them from getting a disease. If you use your health service and you have an illness, you might get some antibiotics to cure the disease, but you're not going to be given antibiotics to prevent you from getting sick, because that's a really terrible use for antibiotics. What it does is it massively increases the likelihood of developing antibiotic-resistant diseases. And by some measures, it's expected that antibiotic-resistant diseases might be one of the leading killers of people globally by 2050. And now that's not all because of factory farming. There are many other reasons, like particularly overuse of antibiotics in some of the developing world is another big issue. So there are a number of reasons why this is the case. But certainly factory farming is a big driver of this. And if we could take the use of these antibiotics out of the food system, this would make a massive difference to our health. And it's probably one of the most damaging things about our food system in terms of health, short of, say, things like overeating and obesity and things like this, which really are cured by people eating different things rather than like changing the food system.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right about the antibiotic thing, and part of and the humans take a lot of antibiotics. Although I think doctors are rethinking that gradually. It takes time to change people's minds. But I think personally, people, if they're worried about climate change, it's a good thing. And it's something that's going to take longer to address. But we're already healthier as a country. In this country, our air and our water, we're addressing it and continue to address it. Antibiotics, because people fear death, they go to these things that they think will cure them or protect them from death. Now, I had a near-death experience, in fact, 22 years ago today. This is my new birthday. I'm only 22, even though my facial hair is gray. Yeah, November 18th, 2002, after 5 days in intensive care, I flatlined. So because people fear death, which is dumb, because I can tell you there's a what's next, because I went from intensive care to what's next. Now, I'm not going to go into what's next today, but if you want to listen to some of my individual podcasts where I tell the story, I don't have a guest, although I've shared it with some guests. I don't want to take away from what our mission is here today, but your point about antibiotics, now, because it's in the food, it's not helpful.
Yeah.
We want the animals to be disease-free. We want humans to be disease-free, which is actually bacteria, right, with antibiotics. It's somewhat unrealistic because when I grew up, now I'm not going to tell you when, but it was a long time ago, we ate dirt. We did all kinds of things because our parents weren't as worried. they weren't as worried. And now, of course, everybody wants this perfect life, this perfect existence, which that in itself is crazy, right? The perfect existence. But, and when I think about what you're doing, it's a dialogue, right? You're forcing people to have a dialogue and to rethink things. What resistance do you get? So we know politics is probably difficult, right? There's a lot of laws, and you just gave an example of one that actually got upheld that you agreed with, right? One of the laws, you wanted it to stay. So when you think of the general population or the factory farms, what's the resistance level that you get, or are things changing?
Yeah, so I think things are changing. I think people are becoming much more aware of the issues around factory farming, both from you mentioned the environment. I think that's a big driver of people's increased concern about the system, but also I think people are becoming much more aware of the impacts on animals from the system and becoming much more compassionate about animals and about the other creatures that we share this planet with. But I think one of the big sticking points for a lot of people is the belief that if I accept that I care about, I don't like factory farming and I care about animals and I don't want them to suffer, that means I have to change my diet and I can't eat animals anymore or something like this. Part of the reason is because a lot of animal organizations tell you that. They say like, oh, if you care about factory farming, you must go vegan or something like this. And I think the big message that we want to tell people is you don't have to change your diet to make a really big difference in the lives of animals and really big difference to this issue of factory farming. There are many other ways to have an impact. For example, you can get involved in these political campaigns. Recently, the city of Berkeley banned factory farming entirely within the city limits. There is work being done in Denver to outlaw slaughterhouses within the environment of Denver, because these kind of industrialized slaughterhouses are also places where animals are killed in very cruel ways because they're doing it to be as fast as possible rather than to give the animals a humane and painless death. Yeah. So there are amazing things going on all around the country that you can get involved with. You can push your own city, your own governor to enact these kinds of measures to give animals better lives, or you can donate. So we have a calculator on our website called the Compassion Calculator. You can find it.
I saw that.
Yeah. CompassionCalculator.org. And what it does basically is...
Wait, say that again.
Yeah, so it's CompassionCalculator.org is the website.
CompassionCalculator.org. I want to make sure people get that. It's fascinating. Go there.
Yeah. So what it does, if you go there, you can put in your own kind of diet, what you eat in a week, and you can see how much money you would need to donate to have do the same amount of good for animals as effectively like not eating any of that food over the week. And it's actually a really small amount of money. So $23 a month is the equivalent for like the average Western diet of going completely kind of animal product free, which is really, for a lot of us, not for everybody, but for a lot of us, that's an extremely kind of manageable amount of money. So you could kind of give your $23 and effectively offset your entire diet from an animal welfare and from a climate point of view. And we think that's a really good illustration to people that actually you can do an incredible amount of good by thinking about these issues in terms of donating, getting involved in political campaigns, these kinds of things. And it doesn't, if you want to change your diet, go for it. But it doesn't have to mean, caring about animals doesn't have to mean changing your diet.
Yeah. Well, and when you think of developing countries, I was donating a similar amount to what you mentioned to an international group that either buys them a goat or a sheep or a pig or a cow, right? Depending on their beliefs. Some countries, they're not going to buy them a pig, of course. But what do you see in developing countries? I mean, is that, say a family of 5 has their own cow, they can get milk. And maybe if they have 2, one could be for meat and one could be for milk. But what do you see is happening in developing countries?
Yeah, so I think these kinds of things where we're talking about giving a family maybe in extreme poverty or close to that an animal that really can be transformative for the lives of these people, this is, I think, almost certainly a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
There is, I mean, all these kind of like global development issues tend to be kind of more complicated. So like we often find that things that seem like they would be like clearly good turn out to be a little bit more complicated and don't work in practice as we like. But like as far as I know, it's very good. But I think what's interesting is in the developing world, so particularly in places like India and China, but also in other rapidly kind of industrializing and growing economies in kind of the developing world. This is actually where industrial animal agriculture is growing fastest. And one of the problems with that is that they, compared to many Western countries, have even fewer welfare laws and even fewer protections for those animals. So it's also really important that as these countries develop, which is good, and people have access to kind of lifestyles more like the lives that we enjoy in the West, that we're also supporting those countries to develop for their own animal welfare laws and things. So one of the charities we support does exactly this. They're an organization called Sinergia Animal, and their work is to help. They basically are people who live in these countries. So they work particularly in Southeast Asia and South America, and they campaign to try to improve the protections for animals in their own countries. But they really rely actually on donations from people in the West and in countries like America, because unsurprisingly, if you're living in, say, Brazil or something, where your income is a fraction of what the average American's income is, you don't necessarily have money to pay for, supporting these animal welfare charities. So these kinds of organizations really rely actually on support from animal lovers in America and in Europe to help them to do this work.
Where do you see the broadest animal welfare laws? What countries?
Yeah, so I think obviously it's not in the whole country, but the California laws are really quite good, and these are some really big steps. Europe in general has been leading the way often on animal welfare laws, and Europe tends to have some of the most kind of strong animal welfare laws and protections for animals, doing things like I said, like these kind of this money for helping farmers to transition into kind of things like plant-based farming, and also even looking at, so there's an amazing being sort of trialed in places like Germany at the moment, where you can actually, so when you're doing egg-laying hens, obviously only the female hens lay eggs, right?
Right.
So when you're doing egg layings, you don't really need that many male chickens. And so what typically happens is when they hatch, people sex the chicks, so they work out if they're male or female, and they keep the female chicks because they're going to grow up and lay lots of eggs. And the male chicks are often killed within a few hours of being born. And this is, I won't go into how this is done, but you can look it up. It's extremely really harrowing to see what happens here. But now we have the technology actually to see in the egg whether this chick is male or female, and so we can prevent all the suffering of that male chick by simply only having the females hatch, and only the females become kind of aware and sentient and able to kind of conscious. So this is a new technology that's immediately eliminating all this kind of suffering, for completely unnecessary, really, suffering for these chickens. And these kinds of things are really exciting because they allow us to make farming kinder and carry on doing the things we need to do to support our populations and things like this, but do it in a way that's much kinder to animals. So these kinds of things which have been tried in Europe, I think, are also quite exciting developments.
Yeah, I think it is a good thing to be kinder and to find extend that to our food supply. I met someone maybe 20 years ago who suggested that the trauma an animal feels at the time of its death is transferred to its own physical body, and that would be the meat that people are consuming. And I certainly think that if people thought about that more, they would inquire, right? They'd want to have a dialogue about how their food is being prepared and how it's living, and then how it's treated at the end. And I've seen some of the stories about the slaughterhouses. Sadly, when there's an outrageous event that occurs, and then it makes the news and you hear about it. So, what can the average person do to raise this dialogue with perhaps their own leaders, right? Their own, maybe it's even local at the town council. I don't know, but maybe you have some experience with that.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. I think there are things we can do at kind of all levels, really. So at the very local level, there are really simple things you can do in terms of pressuring your local councils and things to make sure that their own procurement of food is done with these kinds of issues in mind. So when they're buying food for the school districts or for their own events and things, are they thinking about like where that food is coming from and trying to source it from more sustainable local potentially farms? So they're supporting the local economy and also supporting the kind of farming that we want to see, and also looking at more plant-based alternatives and things like this that can reduce the total impact on the environment of our food too. Mm-hmm. So this is like something we can do at the really local level. At the level of the state of our states and things, if you have ballot initiatives in your states, there's been some real success with in bringing in new animal laws via these ballot initiatives. It's an extremely democratic way of improving our laws because it's not being forced upon us by government above, but it's about us as a community saying what we want laws that represent how our ethics about the way that we want to treat other beings. And I think these are really powerful and have had some real successes, including Proposition 12 is probably the most sort of famous example. And then at the federal level, it's a little bit harder. I think obviously things become more diffuse. But we can think about, what are the policies of our leaders? Are they supporting the kind of transition to a factory farming free future that we want to see through how they're using the FDA and how they're using the Department for Agriculture and things like this? Or are they standing in the way of that and supporting big animal agriculture in opposition to kind of smaller farmers and alternative food systems?
How do you argue with or have a dialogue with people, or maybe a debate with people who would say all of this causes drastic increases in the price of food?
Yeah, so I think
is there any facts supporting that it's minimal, or 3% or 2%, or?
Yeah, so I think these are very valid concerns for people, especially at the moment, right? Like prices are one of the biggest concerns as we're living in an era of inflation. I think some context is helpful in that actually, if you wanted to pick the cheapest way to eat food, you want to be as cost conscious about your food as possible, you would probably be eating something close to a plant-based diet using a lot of whole foods. So, cooking things like chickpeas and beans and things like this. Obviously, this takes, you've got to know a little bit more about how to use the kitchen and things like this to do this, but it's considerably cheaper than any other diet. When it comes to things like cage-free and these kinds of things, they are adding really minimal costs onto the products. But I think also what we have to remember is the price that we pay at the grocery store actually is only, in a funny way, it's only a fraction of the cost of that food, right? Because there are all these externalities. So you don't have to pay because the factory farmer didn't pay for all the environmental damage of raising these animals. Like the local community paid for that in their damaged water supply, in their poorer health, in their own fields and land being damaged. But the factory farmer didn't pay, so he doesn't make you pay for that at the grocery store. But these are still costs that we as a society are having to bear. So if we can stop farming in such a damaging way, this will reduce all of the costs that we pay. That we end up still paying for it in things like our taxes and things like this anyway. So I
Yeah.
think this is we have to think about the total cost of our food in mind, not just the cost at the grocery store, but the entire way in which it affects us, it affects our health and our taxes and all these things like this as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. In my mind, having done some farming, I think it would be minimal. I mean, we just did it that way because we didn't want to have, 3,000 chickens in a confined space. It just didn't make sense to us
Yeah,
as far as the treatment of the animal and how important it was. Fascinating, in a small community of 1,500 people, we sold out all the product that we raised. So I think your point is right. I think it would be minimal. When you think about Bill Gates buying farms, have you heard about what is his goal? Have you ever crossed him? Crossed understood his philosophy and had a chance to talk to him. Crossed his path is what I meant to say.
yeah. So I've heard about this. I could honestly couldn't say that I know why or if indeed it is true that Bill Gates is buying up lots of farmland.
I think overall, it's probably there's good behind it. I would say that he has an interest in looking at our food supply and how it's done, and that's my own personal opinion, right?
Yeah,
But that's my guess.
yeah.
So before we go ahead,
Oh, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, it's certainly something that needs a lot of focus, right? And it would be great if people as influential and with as much money and also as much kind of public influence as someone like Bill Gates was taking an interest in this issue because it's really important. It affects all of us in so many ways. So it would be great if that's the case.
yeah, yeah. So before we close, how do people help FarmKind? How do they get in touch with you? Give us all that information. Say it a couple of times because people might want to write it down. So Tom, tell us how they get in touch with you. How do they help you? Like that.
Yeah, sure. So the easiest way to find everything to do with what we do and our work is to go to www.farmkind.giving. That's our website. There you'll find we have all kinds of things, information about the charities that we support. We have a impact calculator, so you can see just how many animals you could help with a donation of any size that you want to make, and you can donate through there as well. We also have like a newsletter where we send out every other week. We send out kind of positive stories about animals and about our human interaction with animals and things like this. So you can get kind of like a nice little boost of like positive energy about in the middle of your week. We also have things like your standard social medias like Instagram and things. So yeah, farmkind.giving is where you can find all our work, and then the compassion calculator, compassioncalculator.org is where you can find our calculator that allows you to sort of see what the offset for your diet would be. You can also find that through our website as well.
So I'm going to repeat those for you. So it's farmkind.giving.
That's right.
Go to the website and do some research, and maybe reach out to Tom and have a dialogue, further research. And look at what they're doing, because I believe it's expanding small-minded thinking, right? The way we've always done things. I think that Malcolm Goldsmith said, "What got you here won't get you there," right? That it's a good thing to start thinking this way, because I think when you think about farm kind, it's about living that way too, right? Kind to one another, about having a dialogue instead of a monologue, and that finger pointing doesn't get anyone anywhere. It's very negative. And that a dialogue and supporting people that are having a dialogue about doing things differently. And if you don't think animal welfare is important, think about what you eat every night and how did it live. Think about that. I'm just asking you to think about that. And then the calculator give the calculator again, because I think that is really fun. I had fun with it.
I'm glad. So that is at Compassion Calculator.
CompassionCalculator.org. And I encourage all of my listeners in all the countries around the world, it's up to 31. I mean, some of those are only one person, but that could be the most important person that listened to it. And that's what I think about with my work. And every time one person thinks differently about something, expands these places where they listen to this voice right here, what I call the acorn brain. I have it. It's an incessant little voice that runs in my head every day. I don't know if you have it, Tom, but if I listened to some of those things that the voice suggested, my life would be a heck of a lot less productive and healthy if I listened to that little voice. And we have to learn to manage it by having a dialogue and stretching our thinking. And really, that's the gift in the voice, folks, is urging us to manage that voice. Rainer Maria Rilke called it the little hooligan in the 1800s. George Ivanovich Gurdjieff called it the machine, this acorn brain. And what they used to ask was, will you let that voice run you or will you run it? And when you're making quick judgments and you're reacting, you're listening to the voice. So this is a conversation that is going to stretch a lot of people, thinking about where they get their food, the kind of life it lives, and if you're eating animal proteins, you might want to consider that. And farmkind.giving is the place to go. And Tom Norman is the place to reach out to. And the calculator, again, you give it. I like when you say it. Compassion.
CompassionCalculator.org.
It's not that hard, right? CompassionCalculator.org. Tom, thank you so much. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for this conversation. I'm going to hook you up with Ali Horvath of Compassionista.
Sounds great.
And I'll hook you up with the Bonton Farms, because maybe there's something what you're doing could help them in the way they're looking at raising things. And maybe they've had that conversation already, but I'll hook you up with Bonton Farms.
Yeah, that'd be great.
They're doing wonderful work helping felons rebuild their lives when they get released. They're working on the farm and they're selling products. And it's interesting. Your name of your organization is Farm Kind, and I think Bonton Farms is being kind. So there's some synergy there, and I urge all of the listeners to find a way to think about your food, how the animals are treated, and maybe have a dialogue with someone that can do something about it. Tom, thank you.
Thank you.